Marcus Delwood was 38 years old, and until that Saturday evening in October, he had given 9 years of his life to a woman who had decided, somewhere along the way, that he was a problem she had already solved. He owned his own mechanical systems company, Delwood Climate and Air, 14 employees, every payroll met without exception, every service contract honored to the hour. He had built that business with the same methodical patience he had used to lay the radiant floor heating beneath their home on Ashbrook Lane, room by room, one season savings at a time, so that Renata would never feel cold underfoot on a winter morning. That Saturday, at a charity gala hosted by the Piedmont Arts Foundation at the Belk Theater in uptown Charlotte, Renata pulled Marcus into a narrow service corridor between the main hall and the catering kitchen. And in that low-lit space where the noise of the crowd was just a hum through the wall, she drew back and hit him across the right cheekbone with the base of her open palm, a strike precise enough to suggest it had been practiced, or at least considered. Then she smoothed her dress, walked back into the gala, and when someone at the table later asked about the mark forming beneath his eye, she touched his arm with practiced warmth and said he had caught a door in the parking garage, clumsy as ever, always moving too fast when he was distracted. She said it with a laugh in her voice. She said it without looking at him. What Renata did not know, what she had made a point of never bothering to find out, was that in the 16 months prior to that evening, Marcus had been watching the numbers in their joint account shift in ways that did not match any bill he recognized. He had been documenting. He had been waiting. And sitting at that gala table with his face bruising underneath the soft house lights, picking up his water glass with the same steady hand he used when he worked, Marcus Delwood made a decision that Renata would not see coming until it had already arrived. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The Tuesday before the gala had been the kind of October morning Charlotte does right. Cool air carrying the smell of pine from the tree line at the edge of the property. Early light working its way across the side fence Marcus had rebuilt the previous spring when the old panels rotted out. He had replaced each post himself, spending 3 weekends sinking them in fresh concrete, checking plumb, making sure the finished line was true. Renata had asked why he didn't just hire someone. He told her some things you did yourself because the result told you something about what you were made of. He pulled out of the driveway at 6:20 that morning in his work truck, a dark gray F-250 with the Delwood Climate and Air logo on both doors. The letters faded just enough to look like they'd been somewhere. The dashboard held a thermos of black coffee and the day's service call schedule on a clipboard. 3 commercial units downtown, a ductwork inspection in No-Da, a warranty call on a rooftop system he'd installed 18 months ago for a church in Steel Creek. He ran the route in his head as he drove. He had always worked this way, mapping the logic of the day before it started, the way you mapped refrigerant lines before you opened a system, know where everything was supposed to go before you touched anything. His mother had called systems the most honest things in the world. A good system runs quiet, she used to say. The ones that make noise are already broken. She had been a home health nurse for 31 years, and she had meant it medically. But Marcus had spent his adult life finding it true in every context he knew, mechanical, financial, personal. When something started making noise, the noise was never the problem. The noise was the system telling you where to look. He had started hearing noise in the marriage about 2 years ago. Not arguments. They had always argued with a certain practiced fluency, but a different kind of frequency. The way Renata's phone was always face down now when it had never been before. The way she angled her body slightly away when she laughed at something on the screen. A new perfume she hadn't mentioned buying. He had filed these observations the way he filed service anomalies. Noted, time-stamped, not yet acted upon. The house on Ashbrook Lane was a craftsman-style build. 3 bedrooms, a wide front porch Marcus had refinished the summer before, with Brazilian cherry deck boards, fitting each plank himself on long weekends, while Renata was at her continuing education seminars. She was a hospital administrator, director of facilities operations at Carolina's Medical Center, a role she had grown into steadily over the 7 years he'd known her, and one she wore with the careful authority of someone who understood that image was infrastructure. The house reflected her eye for presentation. The porch reflected his. The radiant floor system running beneath the main living areas was the thing Marcus was quietly proudest of. He had designed it himself over a winter, drawn the manifold layout to scale on graph paper, sourced the tubing at cost, and spent 6 weeks of evenings and weekends laying it before the tile went down. Renata had complained about the disruption. When the system ran its first full season without a single cold spot, she stopped mentioning it. He had not needed her to. He thought about her as he drove that Tuesday, turning it over the way he turned over a mechanical problem, methodically, without judgment, looking for the true source. Something had shifted. It had been shifting for a while. And 2 months prior, he had driven to a small electronics shop on South Boulevard and bought a compact indoor camera, the kind marketed as a pet monitor, and mounted it in the corner bookshelf of their living room behind a row of Architectural Digest back issues. He had come home that evening and cooked dinner and said nothing about it. He told himself it was precaution. He told himself that a man who designed systems for a living had a professional obligation to monitor the ones that were running wrong. The first sign of real trouble had arrived 6 weeks before the gala. A Tuesday afternoon, Renata at work, Marcus between service calls and home, briefly to retrieve a parts invoice from his desk. Her phone was on the kitchen counter. The screen was live. She had not locked it when she set it down. He had not meant to read it, but the preview on the screen was already there. Tuesday lunch works better. The foundation board meeting gives us cover through 2. He read it once, set the phone down exactly where he found it, and drove back to his service call. He did not look at it again that day. That evening, he accessed the cloud storage from his camera and reviewed the footage from the past 3 weeks. What he found was not dramatic. It was worse than dramatic. It was procedural. Renata, home early on 2 different Thursdays, speaking on the phone in the living room with her back to the door. On the first recording, she said, "The account is separate. He never checks it closely." On the second, "The timeline only works if the review goes through before spring." He watched both clips 4 times. Then he copied them to a private folder on an encrypted drive, cleared the local history, and went to make dinner. He was calm the way a house is calm after the furnace kicks off, a stillness that had work in it. The next morning, before his first job, Marcus drove to a branch of their shared bank and requested 6 months of joint account statements at the window rather than online. A paper copy, something physical he could hold and mark. He sat in his truck in the bank's parking lot for 40 minutes with a yellow highlighter and a legal pad. The pattern emerged inside the first 10 minutes. Transfers, always midweek, always between $400 and $750, always on days when the business billing cycles deposited their largest amounts into the joint account, when the noise would be highest, when a man who trusted his wife to handle the household finances would be least likely to notice a $580 transfer to an account number he didn't recognize. His hands did not shake. He went back further. He pulled 3 more months from the ATM history on his phone. Then he called his bank and requested a full 16-month statement mailed to his office address, not the house. When it arrived 4 days later, he sat down with it on a Saturday morning and built the complete picture. The transfers were consistent, deliberate, paced, never enough in a single month to register as alarming, always enough to accumulate into something significant. He filled 2 full pages of his legal pad with columns and dates. The total, across 16 months, was $28,400. It was not an accident. It was a plan. And the plan had been running quietly while he built the fence and serviced the rooftop units and made sure 14 people got paid every 2 weeks on time. He picked up his phone, scrolled to his cousin Calvin's number, and called. Calvin had spent 22 years as a senior paralegal at one of Charlotte's larger family law firms before going independent. He answered before the second ring and listened without interrupting while Marcus walked him through the account statements, the camera footage, the phone preview he had read by accident in his own kitchen. When Marcus finished, Calvin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You need to call Claudette Bernard. I'll text you her number right now." Marcus thanked him, ended the call, and drove to his first job site. The gala was that Saturday. He went. He wore the charcoal suit he kept pressed for the 2 or 3 times per year it was required. He sat at the table where Renata's hospital colleagues and their spouses filled the chairs with practiced social ease. People who understood that charity events were professional infrastructure as much as they were charitable. He ate the food that was served, answered questions about his business with straightforward brevity, and was generally unremarkable. He watched. Preston Okafor was at a table diagonal to theirs. Marcus had met him twice before. A commercial architect in his mid-40s. Good-looking in a way that required some maintenance. The kind of man who wore his tailoring as a credential. He sat on the Piedmont Arts Foundation board, a fact Marcus had discovered 3 days earlier when he searched the foundation's publicly posted board roster. Okafor had been on that board for 22 months. The timeline of Renata's behavioral shift and the timeline of Okafor's board tenure aligned inside a margin of about 6 weeks. Marcus noted the way Renata's posture changed when Okafor stood to speak during the foundation's brief remarks. A degree of attention that was too steady to be casual. He filed it and continued eating. In the service corridor, after her palm connected with his cheekbone, he said nothing for a moment. He let the pain register, let the reality of what had just happened settle fully into the present tense. Then he said, "We should go back in. They'll wonder where we are." He straightened his jacket, returned to the table, and picked up his fork. Over the following 2 hours, through coffee and dessert and the gradual wind-down of the event, the bruise developed. He could feel the heat of it spreading. Across the table, a woman named Petra, a structural engineer Marcus had worked alongside on 2 commercial projects over the past 5 years, a woman with a quiet precision he had always respected, glanced from the mark on his face to Renata's composed expression and back, and said nothing. But she saw. In the parking garage afterward, when Renata had gone ahead to retrieve her car, Marcus stood for a moment in the concrete quiet and called Calvin. "Happened again," he said when Calvin answered, publicly this time. She covered it at the table immediately. "I'm calling Claudette Bernard tonight." He ended the call, took out his phone, and photographed his face in the parking garage's fluorescent light from 4 angles. The mark was unmistakable. He forwarded everything to Calvin with a single line. For the file. Claudette Bernard answered on the second ring. Her voice carried the particular calm of someone who had been in family law for 3 decades and had stopped being surprised by what people did to each other in the privacy of shared lives. She listened to everything without interruption. When Marcus finished, she asked, "Do you have the transfers documented?" He told her he had 16 months of statements, highlighted and notated. She said, "Bring them Monday morning. Bring everything. I'll see you at 8. He drove home. Renata was already inside. He went to his home office, closed the door softly, and accessed the camera cloud storage. The clip he needed was from that evening. Renata in the living room, an hour before they left for the gala, phone to her ear, voice low but audible. No, he won't say anything. He never does. That's the thing about him. He absorbs everything and keeps going. She had laughed softly after saying it. He saved the clip, added it to the encrypted folder, and sent a copy to Calvin. He sat in his office chair for a while after that. The anger he might have expected didn't arrive. What came instead was clarity, the kind that settled over a job when you finally isolated the fault, when the diagnostic made the problem visible and therefore solvable. He had spent months watching a system fail. He now understood the failure completely. The next step was not emotional. It was procedural. He went to bed. He slept. Claudette Bernard's office was on the 4th floor of a building on South Tryon, the kind of office that communicated competence without spectacle. Glass front bookshelves, a clean conference table, no framed motivational statements. She was in her late 50s, silver-haired, and she reviewed what Marcus laid out on her table with the focused attention of someone reading a circuit schematic for the first time, working through it systematically, asking precise questions, making notes on a yellow legal pad in a small, even hand. After 40 minutes, she looked up. She said, "The systematic transfer of jointly held marital assets to an undisclosed private account with documented behavioral evidence of intent to exit the marriage constitutes financial fraud under North Carolina marital asset statutes. When you add the documented physical assault, twice, with the second instance captured on your living room footage, and the cover story corroborated by her own words on your camera, Diana has built an extremely clean case against herself." She paused. "Renata, I mean." He nodded. "She has," he said simply. Claudette closed her portfolio and tapped her pen once on the table. "We move quietly and we move completely. Agreed?" Agreed. Real power operated in quiet rooms. His mother had known that. Claudette Bernard clearly knew it too. 3 days after Marcus met with Claudette, he drove to Calvin's house on a Thursday evening and sat down at the kitchen table where Calvin had spread out 2 weeks of independent research across the polished wood surface. A cup of coffee sat at Marcus's elbow, steam rising in the evening quiet. "What do you have?" Marcus said. Calvin pulled a printed stack across the table. Preston Okafor, born 1977, Charlotte native, licensed commercial architect. Founded Okafor Design Partners in 2009. Good reputation, clean record, active in civic circles. He's been on the Piedmont Arts Foundation board for 22 months. But here's the more relevant part. He slid a second document forward. The Arts Foundation has an advisory relationship with Carolina's Medical Center's Facilities Development Program. Corporate partnerships, capital project recommendations, interdepartmental budget review. Okafor sits at that intersection. Marcus read through the document slowly. "What's the advancement timeline?" Calvin opened his laptop and turned the screen. Renata received 2 upward reclassifications in the hospital's administrative structure in the past 18 months. Both came with compensation adjustments. The first was 14 months ago, the second was 8 months ago. Standard advancement for her tenure and position would typically require 3 to 4 years between reclassifications of this size. He was in position to influence it, Marcus said. Exactly. And the timing overlaps with their involvement by a margin of roughly 6 weeks. Marcus sat back and wrapped his hands around the coffee mug. He stared at the documents without expression. Then he said, "Keep going. I need everything documented. He picked up his truck keys. I have an early crew rotation. You're going to work? Calvin said. Payroll runs Friday, Marcus replied. That doesn't move. He drove toward the job site in Steel Creek, where his crew was running a full commercial HVAC replacement on a medical office building. His mind moved between refrigerant specifications and the documents on Calvin's table with the same even rhythm. An HVAC system and a marriage had this in common. The damage that ruined them never happened all at once. It happened in small pressure losses over long months, invisible until the day the whole thing stopped holding. Preparation is the work, he thought. The repair comes later. 4 days later, Calvin and Claudette met together at Calvin's kitchen table with Marcus, and between the three of them, they finished the picture. The bank statements, the camera footage, the advancement timeline, the foundation board documentation. Laid out in sequence, it was not a story about passion or impulse. It was a plan. Renata had been engineering an exit, funded, insulated, time to leave Marcus holding a mortgage on a life she had already mentally vacated. She thought I wasn't paying attention, Marcus said. They always think that, Claudette replied. There was one more thing Calvin had found. He pulled a printout from the bottom of the stack. Renata and Petra serve on the same interdisciplinary committee for the hospital's Facilities Safety Review Board. Petra's firm has provided structural review services to Carolina's Medical Center on 2 renovation projects. She would know Preston Okafor's name professionally. She would know exactly what board he sat on. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He thought about the gala table, the way Petra's eyes had moved from Renata's face to his and back, the weight of what she had chosen not to say. I'll call her, he said. He stepped out onto Calvin's porch that evening, the October air carrying a smell of leaves and wood smoke from somewhere down the block. He found Petra's number and pressed dial. She answered on the 3rd ring. Marcus. Hey, I'm sorry to call late. Don't be. Her voice was careful. Is everything okay? He let a pause settle before answering. I'm trying to understand something. He kept his voice measured, a degree of confusion in it that was more real than it sounded. Renata's always said you two understood each other. I just wondered if you'd noticed anything. Petra was quiet for a moment. Then, Marcus, she said. I don't think I'm in a position to answer that carefully enough to be useful to you. But I'll say this. What I saw at the gala on Saturday wasn't the first time I'd watched her do something I didn't know how to file. I appreciate that, he said. He ended the call and stood on the porch for a moment in the quiet. The leaves moved in the oak tree at the corner of Calvin's fence. Marcus breathed it in, steady, and went back inside. The next morning he went home, showered, changed, and had breakfast at his kitchen table. Renata came down in her work clothes, poured coffee, checked her phone. He asked about her day. She told him. He asked if she wanted him to look at the kitchen faucet that had been running slightly warm on cold, a pressure issue he had been meaning to check. She said that would be fine. He kissed her cheek before she left. He waited. Renata moved first on a Wednesday afternoon, 11 days after the gala. The envelope arrived at his office by courier. Heavy cream paper, official letterhead, certified tracking. He read it at his desk, then read it again. Her attorney had filed a counterclaim. The language was precise and extensive. Allegations of emotional withholding over multiple years. Claims of financial domination and restricted access to household accounts. Assertions that Marcus had created an environment of economic control and professional isolation. The letter concluded with a demand. Marcus was to vacate the marital home within 60 days. Renata would retain primary financial interest in the property. He set the letter down, picked up his phone, and dialed Claudette's direct line. "She just handed me everything," he said when she answered. "She handed us everything," Claudette replied. Her voice carried the particular satisfaction of a professional who had been expecting exactly this moment for 11 days. "I'll file the response by Friday. Have Calvin come in Thursday morning." The mediation office on East Trade Street had the specific quality of spaces designed to contain consequence without amplifying it. Recessed lighting, a long oval table in pale oak, chairs in muted charcoal, a pitcher of water that no one ever seemed to pour from. Marcus arrived 20 minutes early. Claudette at his left, Calvin positioned just behind. The banker's box sat centered on the table in front of Marcus, precisely placed. He had loaded it that morning with the same attention he gave to loading a service van. Everything in its designated position. Everything accessible. His father had told him, "The work before the work is what the work depends on." Renata arrived with her attorney, a man in a well-fitted gray suit who carried a leather portfolio and the practiced composure of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in the room. Renata wore a charcoal blazer and an expression of calibrated authority. She sat down without looking at Marcus directly. The mediator, a woman in her 60s named Judge Elaine Satterwhite, retired district court, 3 decades in family law, began with the procedural standard. Marcus listened without hearing it. His attention was on the box. Renata's attorney opened by reiterating the counterclaim. Patterns of financial control and emotional withholding, documented instances of Marcus limiting Renata's access to household resources, an environment of systematic restriction over the course of 9 years. "If I may," Claudette said. Her voice was level and unhurried. She opened her portfolio and removed the first document. What followed was not dramatic. It was thorough. First, 16 months of joint account statements, with midweek transfers highlighted in yellow. Small amounts, always between $400 and $750, always on days when business billing activity created cover noise in the account. The transfers moved consistently to an account number Marcus had never seen. Total extracted, $28,400. Claudette placed the final annotated page on the table and let the numbers sit. Renata's attorney called the first recess. When they returned, Claudette presented the photographs of Marcus's injuries, both occasions. The bruise from the gala, documented that same night in the parking garage fluorescence, 4 angles, timestamp embedded. The mark from the previous incident, photographed the morning after, clinical, unambiguous. Renata kept her face neutral. Her attorney was less successful. Then the camera footage. First clip, Marcus's living room, the night before the gala. Renata on the phone, voice clear and audible. "The account is separate. He never checks it closely." Second clip, Renata in the same living room, 3 weeks earlier. "The timeline only works if the review goes through before spring." Third clip, the evening of the gala, 1 hour before they left. "He won't say anything. He never does. That's the thing about him. He absorbs everything and keeps going." She had laughed in that third clip. Claudette let it play until the laugh finished. Renata's attorney called the second recess. When they reconvened, Claudette placed the advancement documentation on the table. Preston Okafor's board roster position, the 2 reclassification events, the timeline showing each advancement occurring within a window of months, following confirmed contact between Okafor and the hospital's advisory structures. The ethics policy language from the Piedmont Arts Foundation board charter, highlighting the disclosure requirements for board members with professional or personal relationships to institutions receiving foundation support. No one in the room spoke for a moment. Renata turned and looked at Marcus for the first time since they had sat down. She was searching his face for something. The version of him she had catalogued. The man who absorbed and continued, who never escalated, who could be relied upon to hold his position quietly while the ground shifted beneath him. He met her eyes with patience. Whatever she was looking for, it had left before she'd thought to check. Her attorney conferred with her in a low voice. Then he withdrew the counterclaim without ceremony. He said simply that his client wished to discuss a resolution. Marcus slid the settlement proposal across the table. He would retain the Ashbrook Lane property, his business, and all retirement accounts held in his name. Renata would receive what remained in the joint savings account, minus the $28,400 and accrued legal fees. She would keep her personal vehicle and personal property. Both parties would sign a binding non-disparagement agreement. Renata read it. She looked up once. "You've had this ready for weeks," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I've had it ready since the parking garage," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she picked up the pen and signed. Claudette closed her portfolio with a quiet finality that was more emphatic than any statement she could have made. Marcus stood, lifted the banker's box, and walked out into the October afternoon. The light on East Trade Street was gold and slanted, the kind that made Charlotte look like it was being photographed. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed it in. Behind him, the mediation room held only the hum of the HVAC unit and the weight of what had been documented. The professional consequences moved at the speed of public records. The mediation settlement filing entered the courthouse system 3 days after the signing, and discovery documents became part of that record, which meant the timeline of Renata's advancements and Preston Okafor's board position and the intersection of those two facts became accessible to anyone who knew where to look. A journalist who covered the local business community for a Charlotte weekly knew where to look. So did 2 members of the Piedmont Arts Foundation's Ethics Subcommittee. The foundation convened a special session the following month. Okafor had submitted his resignation letter by the time they convened, 3 days ahead of the scheduled vote. The distinction, resigning versus being removed, changed nothing about the record. His name was removed from 2 naming plaques that had been budgeted for the foundation's new gallery wing. The donor community absorbed this information with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that reputation was a system just as fragile and just as load-bearing as any other. 2 of Okafor's active commercial development projects had used community investment structures tied to the foundation's capital network. With the ethics finding on record, the Oversight Committee initiated immediate review of both. One project lost its funding structure entirely. The other was restructured under new oversight, with Okafor no longer listed as principal architect. His firm's project pipeline contracted significantly over the following quarter. Renata's administrative leave, already initiated by the hospital's HR office in response to the conflict of interest documentation from the mediation, converted to a formal separation from her position by year's end. She did not contest it. The advancement records and the board documentation made contesting it a more complicated proposition than simply leaving. Calvin heard about Okafor's board resignation through his professional network and mentioned it to Marcus over the phone one evening in November. Marcus said, "I heard. Anything else?" Calvin said, "Not really." Marcus said, "All right." He finished the call and went back to the estimate he was reviewing for a new commercial contract. The work continued. It always had. 14 months after the signing, Marcus was in the backyard of the Ashbrook Lane property on a Saturday morning, replacing the last section of the fence run along the north side that hadn't been touched when he rebuilt the rest the previous year. The October air was cool and clear. carrying the same pine and dry leaf smell that had come through his truck window on that Tuesday before everything came into focus. He had hired 2 additional technicians over the summer, bringing Delwood Climate and Air to 16 employees. A partnership inquiry had come in from a regional facilities management firm, preliminary conversations only, nothing signed, but the direction was clear. The work had been good for a long time. It remained good. He heard the back door open and turned to find Petra coming across the deck with 2 mugs of coffee. She moved through the space with the ease of someone who had been present in it long enough to stop thinking about how she moved through it. They had been whatever this was for 3 months, unhurried, unbothered by the absence of formal definition. She had called him the week after the mediation, not to ask questions, but to say, "I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner." He had told her that what she said by saying nothing at that gala table was enough. She had understood what he meant. She handed him the mug and stood beside him, looking at the fence section he was working on. "Running straight?" she asked. He checked the line. "Almost," he said. "One post is 4 millimeters off." She gave him a look that meant she was deciding between saying something and not saying something. Then she said, "You would notice 4 millimeters." He smiled at that. He took a sip of the coffee. She went back inside. He set the mug on the fence rail and picked up his level. The morning was quiet, except for the birds somewhere in the oak canopy, and the distant sound of a neighbor's lawn equipment starting up one street over. He worked his way down the fence line, checking each post, tapping the ones that needed it, letting the process be what it was. His mother's voice came in easy when he worked with his hands. She had been gone 4 years now, and her voice was clearer than it had ever been when she was alive. The way some truths needed distance to become audible. A good system runs quiet. The ones that make noise are already broken. He had spent 9 years in a system that had been making noise he taught himself not to hear. He had absorbed and continued and made himself useful, thinking that usefulness was the same thing as being valued. He understood now that they were not the same thing. Usefulness could be cataloged. Being valued was different. Being valued meant someone noticed what was quiet. He set the level against the last post and read the bubble. Perfect. He stepped back, looked down the full run of fence. True from end to end. He picked up his mug, took the last swallow of coffee, and looked at the yard. The grass coming back evenly after the summer. The tree line at the far end, the morning light moving across all of it at the angle it moved across everything he had built and kept and let go and begun again. He carried his tools back to the garage, hung each one in its place, and closed the door. He went inside. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.